This is Greg Troutwine with Maritime Reporter TV, and we're very pleased to be joined again by Philip Lewis, the Director of Research at World Energy Reports, to discuss his updated report on opportunities in the U.S. offshore wind market. So, Phil, this report seems more optimistic than your last report on the U.S. Wind industry from earlier this year. Specifically, what has changed?
Right. Well, since April of this year, the White House has set a national development target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 110 gigawatts by 2050. A major project in federal waters has been approved for construction. That's Vineyard 1. 6 projects in federal waters are under final review by BOEM. 2.6 gigawatts of project activity has secured New York State procurements, and 11.6 gigawatts of new federal leasing activity is in the Northeast in California is underway.
You mentioned specifically the White House target of 30 gigawatts by 2030. How important is that?
Well, at one level, you can argue that the 30 gigawatt target is only formalizing what the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states have been doing over many years, as they've been driving offshore wind development through their general renewable energy targets, specific offshore wind goals and procurements. Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states have offshore wind goals that amount to a cumulative 34 gigawatts by 2030, 2030 to 2035. Now, over 14 gigawatts of that has already been procured by states from offshore wind projects. Another 8.5 gigawatts of capacity is planned to be tied up in planned offtakes and in the short to mid-term. That said, the White House statement has led to an energized federal review and leasing process. BOEM is the federal agency responsible for managing the offshore wind construction and operations permitting process, in OCS or federal waters. BOEM has finally approved the first commercial scale wind farm in federal waters. That's the Vineyard 1 project. As I mentioned, the final investment decision on this $3 billion project is expected to come in the coming months. BOEM has increased the number of projects under permitting review from 1 to 6, and we expect more projects to join the review process in the short term. BOEM has also advanced the leasing process for 7 gigawatts of new East Coast leases and over 4.5 gigawatts of West Coast leases. And finally, BOEM is taking the first steps to initiate Gulf of Mexico leasing, all for offshore wind, of course.
As you well know, everybody loves numbers, and those capacity numbers sound rather large. But what do they really mean?
Oh, that's a fair question. Lots of gigawatt numbers there. So let's put that 30 gigawatt number in context of the global offshore wind installed capacity. Now, at the end of 2020, that amounted to around 32 gigawatts globally. The first European offshore wind farm was commissioned in 1991. The first large-scale wind farms appeared in the 2000s, and industrialization of the sector accelerated in the last decade. The US market will benefit from this industrialization of the wind sector, and there is now a US project development pipeline of over 40 gigawatts of projects. Final investment decisions are expected for 19 projects over the next 18 months. Most of the projects will be larger wind farms in the federal waters of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, but the forecast also includes a demonstration project in the Great Lakes and 4 floating demonstration projects, 2 each in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Our forecast represents a much higher level of activity than was anticipated 6 months ago.
As we've discussed many times before, this is an opportunity for multiple sectors. How does this specifically translate to the supply chain opportunity?
Well, at least 40 offshore wind projects are forecast to be developed within this decade. CapEx spend will exceed $136 billion. Once the projects are delivered, annual recurring OPEX will amount to more than $4 billion. At the end of life, decommissioning activities represent a spend of over $18 billion. So ports, fabricators, component manufacturers, vessel operators, engineering firms, and lenders will all benefit from these opportunities. The White House statement that we mentioned earlier, that highlighted the support of building domestic supply chain capability. Now, that's a very common theme in offshore wind development globally. Multiple federal agencies will be involved in managing loans and financial support for the domestic supply chain. Now, a key aim of the White House is to anchor 1 or 2 US factories for each major wind farm component. This is unlikely to benefit the first wind farms to be built. These will rely mostly on components manufactured in Europe and transported to the United States for marshalling in US ports and then installation in US waters. This will change over time with commitments having been announced for some key component factories. Now, the target of 4 to 6 locally owned and built specialized turbine installation vessels is a new initiative. One WTIV is already under construction in the US, Brownsville. 4 to 6 WTIVs will help ease a potential supply shortage of installation vessels in the US that we've identified, especially as the global market will be very busy from the middle of the decade. However, the high capex of WTIVs built in US shipyards, that we're estimating close to 40% higher than that of South Korean and Chinese yards, will add to project costs. It's likely that the installation of US wind farms will be carried out by a mix of some Jones Act compliant and foreign flag vessels in the foreseeable future.
You mentioned floating wind. What's happening there?
Well, you're right, Greg. The short-term forecast includes 4 floating wind demonstration projects, 2 each in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Our long-term forecast also includes 4.6 gigawatts of floating wind projects off the California coast. That's commercial scale wind farms. So the demonstrators are an important step. Floating wind is a maturing technology, but remains at pre-commercial scale arrays at the moment. The supply chain required to deliver large-scale developments is very different from that for bottom fixed wind farms. Demonstration arrays will help identify the challenges of delivering commercial-scale floating wind projects in the US as we move towards the end of the decade.
Okay. Phil, superb as always. Thank you for your time.
No, thanks, Greg. It's been a pleasure.